Hi, everyone. I'm Lin from the Chinese University Press. On behalf of the press, I sincerely welcome everyone here. I know many of our distinguished guests and also our colleagues, students from the university. This is going to be an exciting talk, so I can guarantee you. Today, we'll first have Professor Vogel talk, but before that, we have two distinguished guests who will also give a short introduction of today's talk. One is our VVC Vice Chancellor, Professor Fanny Chang, who is here today, also joined us for the book talk. She will share us a little a warm welcome for Professor Vogel. And then Professor Ambrose, who is our former Vice Chancellor at Chinese University, and also a very good friend of Professor Vogel. So it's kind of a legendary dialogue today between two legendary scholars. So this is really rare. So after Professor Vogel's talk, we'll have about 30 to 40 minutes Q&A. So if you have a question, I think you have plenty of time to ask after the talk. And after that, if time permits, Professor Vogel kindly agreed to sign maybe a few books today because he has a really tight schedule. He has another meeting to go right after this talk. So we'll see how it goes depending on the time. So first, let's welcome Professor Fanny Chen to give us a very brief introduction of the talk. Thank you.
First of all, on behalf of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, as well as CU Press, since I'm also chair of the Senate Committee of CU Press, I'd like to welcome you all to this book talk. 8 years ago, in the same room, we celebrated the publishing of Professor Vogel's new book on Deng Xiaoping. Today, it's a great honor to welcome him back to talk about his new book, China and Japan, Facing History. It's also great to have Professor Ambrose, who is an old friend of Professor Vogel for over half a century, to give the introduction. And I have to pay respect to Ambrose, who has been my teacher since I joined the CUHK. So with this, I'd like to welcome Professor King.
Ganqi, of course, Professor Fanny Chang, and dear friends and colleagues, and ladies and gentlemen. At last, we're going to have Vogel's talk, the book talk, which was originally scheduled on November 11. But of course, very extraordinary situation made us unable to do that. But today, you will give the talk, China and Japan. Actually, I don't know whether you need an introduction or not. Anyhow, your book probably already been read by people. But I'm going just to very briefly mention about Vogel as a scholar. Professor Vogel of Harvard, of course, he is an internationally renowned scholar in Asian studies. Vogel has devoted to Japan and China studies no less than 50 years. So we began to know each other roughly at 50 years. I look at my own picture. I even cannot recognize how young I was at the time. He is indisputably a leading scholar in both Japan and China studies. His 1979 Japan as #1. I don't think you will regret you do that one.
Oh, not at all.
No. And his 2012 Deng Xiaoping and the Transformation of China, the two books, each would become later bestsellers on the top list in two countries. I usually think It's probably you know you are one of the richest the academics in the world today.
Not rich, not rich.
Because
he
donated
donated all donated money to the Harvard University.
Not Harvard.
No, to my High
Not
Wesleyan.
Harvard, yeah.
The money
Okay.
from Deng Xiaoping I gave to
So
my little
only
college.
if you didn't donate it, then you were one of the richest.
No.
And the publication of these two books I mentioned is a good testimony to Vogel's unusual insight in selecting research topics of historical relevance and significance. Now, who can think about it? Japan's number one, and Deng Xiaoping, all right? This is wonderful topics. I cannot help thinking how amazing Ezra is to bring us a 500-page long new book on both China and Japan at the age of 89. 89.
Right.
But now, he's 90.
No, by Chinese standards. I'm
Believe it or
90. By American, I'm still 89.
But here in China, let's take you Chinese.
Right, yeah.
China and Japan, Facing History, is Vogel's first book, taking China and Japan as a unit of studies, studied those two countries, not separately. He studied two countries' history of relationship of 1,500 years. That's relationship between China and 1,500 years. He set his mind on two countries' relationship in a very long historical context, past, present, and possibly future. As a seasoned scholar on both China and Japan studies, Vogel has not only profound knowledge of China and Japan. Really, every time I read your book, I found I learned something new. Really profound, really. He also has developed deep understanding and affection for the people of these two countries. That's very important. Obviously, Ezra is greatly pleased to see Japan and China rising and becoming world's third and second largest economy in his lifetime of professional career. How could you remember? 50 years ago, he wrote two books on China and Japan. These two now become world's second largest economy in the world. Why Professor Vogel decided to write this book? 8 years ago. He decided to write this book 8 years ago. In the year of 2010 and 2011, the relationship between China and Japan became so tense and even dangerous. In fact, according to the survey, less than 10% of each population had positive feeling toward other. Less than 10%. That's really very dangerous. Indeed, this situation became his overwhelming concern. What is going to happen? Thus, he feels that as a friend of both countries, he has a special kind of responsibility to help improve the relationship between China and Japan. Not every writer would have this kind of feeling. He feels a special kind of responsibility. This is the prime drive for Vogel to write this book. Professor Vogel thinks that what a friend, he considers a friend, and also a bystander, can do best is to provide an objective, rational account of the history of 1,500 years of relationship between his beloved China and Japan. So he sincerely believes that facing history by Chinese, by by Japanese is the best way for both countries. It's the best way for Chinese and Japanese to know themselves, to know the other, and to live together peacefully and friendly. Vogel is of the belief that only through facing history honestly and directly, Chinese and Japanese will begin to know themselves and know each other better. 中国的老子 has a saying, knowing others is wisdom. Knowing oneself is enlightenment. 知人者智，自知者明. That's quite smart, you know. Vogel is obviously of the belief that in facing history, both Chinese and Japanese will gain enlightenment and wisdom, and will begin to see and reflect that present day's tense and dangerous relationship were not necessarily historical normal, and that there were historical periods in which China and Japan had indeed very close cultural connections and mutual understanding, even mutual appreciation. So I must say, Vogel's effort in unpacking the present day's relationship is full of goodwill and also with wisdom. Indeed, as Vogel clearly recognized that, he said, quote, "It is unrealistic that China and Japan will quickly develop feelings of trust and become close friends." Quote, "Of course, you're not naive. Nevertheless, I still want to say, if there were a book which will help to improve the China-Japan relationship and to open a new way for two countries and its people in building new partnership, then Vogel's China and Japan facing history is the one." Vogel, do you believe that? I really think so. Incidentally, just a few days ago, leaders of China and Japan in Chengdu, you know, near Chongqing, Chengdu, have shown very clearly the design in the two parts, and even new thinking in search of communication and cooperation. I think Professor Vogel should be very pleased to see the new development. So now, of course, your purpose is coming here to hear Professor Vogel talk. So I now turn to Professor Vogel for this very long-awaited talk. Thank you.
It's very, I'm of course very pleased to have my old friend Ambrose King say so many nice things, overly praising me, and we are old friends. Indeed, looking around the room, I see so many good old friends like Chen Fengqing and Jan Kiley and Jacobson, my colleague at Harvard, and David Foer, who's a really respected historian, and Jean Hung, who's everybody's favorite librarian, and many others. And I do feel a special attachment to this university. In 1963-64, I spent 1 year in Hong Kong, just at the time we were setting up the University Service Center. And at the time, your first, you call it Vice Chancellor, right? Yes. He was just setting up the places. Li Choming. And I talked to him at that time, just as he was beginning to move the various colleges to this site. And so I remember the excitement of founding this campus and felt very close. And then, of course, I spent many times at the University Service Center when Jean was there at Argyle Street. And then Fengqing and I had a role in bringing the University Center to the Chinese University. And it was a pleasure to work with him at that time. And now I'm very pleased that the Chinese edition of my book is from Yeo-chi, who's been a wonderful advisor and editor and supervisor, and bringing Lin Ying and Yamin Lei, such wonderful scholars to work with me in revising the book, first on Deng Xiaoping, and now the pleasure of publishing the Chinese edition of both of those books through Yeo-chi. And we're even talking, if I live long enough and able to write more books, I would want to go, of course, to the Chinese University Press. So it's a very special treat for me to be back. This is like a second home to me as a place for thinking about this part of the world. When as Ambrose said, 2010, when I was finishing Deng Xiaoping book and thinking about what to do next, it was just at the time when China and Japan had their worst relationships. In 2010, that was the time when the ships bumped into each other. And it was the year that the World Bank said that the Chinese university, that the China economy is passing the Japanese economy in size. So that was a very tense year, and I'll come to that later. But what I want to talk about, I'm sorry that many of you have already read the book, because what I say now really comes out of the book and will be repetition, but at least some of the things that I think are most important of what I wrote about. Compared to European countries, which bumped into each other all the time, the two major powers of East Asia were separated by water, so did not have such close contact. There were times, of course, when they fought on the Korean Peninsula in the 660s, when the Tang Dynasty troops were coming there, and some of the Japanese troops went in to help Yeo-chi on the Korean Peninsula. They fought at the time of the Mongol invasion of Kyushu in the 12th century. They fought again when Hideyoshi came up through Korea with the intention of attacking Beijing. They fought again at the Jiabuzhanzheng in 1895. They fought, of course, in World War II. So there were times when they fought, not as many times as European powers fought with each other, but very significant powers. But in deciding to work on this book, I felt I had to know the history, because a lot of Chinese came to me and said the problem with working with Japan is they don't know their history. And I felt I'm not a historian. I have no professional qualifications to be a historian. But I decided that I would try to learn about history. So for 7 years I worked and I tried to read. I don't read classical Chinese, I don't read classical Japanese. I tried to learn as much as I could from a lot of basic scholarship that others have done, and tried to present an overview. But in addition to the times when they fought, they also learned a lot from each other. And there were 3 times that stuck out when they really learned a tremendous amount. And so I've made that a major part of my book. They're learning from each other. The first time began in 593, and Empress Suiko decided in Japan. At that time, Japan had a clan organization, a relatively small population, and the rule was by about 30 clans which had a relationship with each other. So the closest thing they had to a national structure was kind of a council of clans that worked with each other. And Suiko wanted to expand the territorial area that she ruled over, and expand the area, and realized that she needed something like an administrative state that was better organized. And the place in the world that probably had the most developed administrative state was centered in Chang'an. And so she began planning already soon after she came power to send representatives to Chang'an. And so there in the Sui, late in the Sui dynasty, they sent their first mission around the year 600 to China to begin to learn. And then over the next period, until 838, they sent quite a few missions. And typically they would send 3 or 4 ships in a mission. there would be perhaps 15 to 20 years between missions. They sent less than 20 missions in all, and the small ships were in danger, so there were always special prayers when they sent off the ships, because there was a danger that one of the ships would sink, and very often the ships did sink. But they began to send missions to China to learn, and in order what they needed to administrative state. So what they began learning was so basic for the building of Japanese culture. First of all, in order to govern a broader area, it was important to have some written documents. And you couldn't depend on people far away and with not very good transportation. You had to have fairly careful laid out directions and reports from those areas, so they needed written documents. So they began to learn to write calligraphy the first time. They began to write characters. So they learned that from China. But they also learned how to structure an administrative state, the various parts of the government. They also wanted to train select talent, so that China, which has always, throughout its history, found ways to select talent and to train officials. The Japanese also began to have some examinations to select elite people, not necessarily from the leading clans. Before they began sending missions to China, it was always the stronger clans that had the key positions. But when you began to develop some kind of way for talent to be selected to take the administrative positions, then they were often not sort of from the stronger clan, sometimes from the weaker clan. Japan, throughout history, has given more emphasis to heredity than China did, but still they learned somewhat the examination system. When they also tried to think of how they would provide legitimation for their own government, they turned to China both for Buddhism and for Confucianism. Because Buddhism at that time, from the Chinese Tianhuang, the Chinese emperor, that implied some relation with heaven, that he had some legitimacy over ruling with the earth. And so the Japanese used the word tenno when they began to think of their leader. Also, some relation with the heavens, which gave them some legitimation over ruling the earth down below. But in addition to that legitimation, they found that Confucianism, which trained loyalty, not only the younger brother to older brother, but to the rulers. As a philosophy for gaining legitimation for the government, it was really very useful. And also, of course, China is famous for writing dynastic histories. And the dynastic history, to me, as one who's not a deep scholar, the essence always seemed to be that the current regime is very legitimate, and they beat out the bad guys, and the guys who remain are the good guys. And so the Japanese wanted to write their own history. But because they considered heredity so important, they did the Chinese one better. Instead of just doing dynasty by dynasty, which later became the Chinese pattern, they went way back to the beginning of time and created Jimu Tenno, their original founder, who came down from heaven, and they have one continuous history. But it came, that idea came from studying the Chinese dynastic history. And then they studied, so the Nihon Shoki and the basic books of Japan that were written in that early era. Unfortunately, before 600, before they learned written language from China, they could not reliably pass on their history. There was some oral history which they tried to incorporate in those books, which scholars who worked on the field are very unreliable, except for maybe the 50 or 100 years immediately before they began writing those books, when the records were a little more, the memories were a little crisper and a little more reliable. So all those things that the Japanese took from the China. But not only that, when they began to decide that they needed a capital city, they modeled it on Chang'an. And before that time, because of the clan organization, they moved around the center of the government from one clan to another clan. But they felt, for the administrative state, they needed a settled city. So they began to develop Nara first Nara, which is exactly on the plan of Chang'an. It was much smaller because the population was much smaller, but the basic idea of the numbered streets, the cross, the leading court to be at the north end, all that was copied from Chang'an to Nara. And later, when the Japanese thought that the religious groups were getting too much power, they decided to move the capital to Kyoto. And the Kyoto also followed Chang'an on a little bigger scale than Nara. So even today, if you go to Kyoto, Ichigo-Nigo, go from number 1 to number 9, the number just as it was in Chang'an, and with the capital at the north end, and the Buddhist monasteries over the east and west sides. So the idea of city also. Until that time, the Japanese did not have very well-developed architecture. The famous shrine at Ise, every 20 years they would rebuild it because the poles would rot and they didn't have a strong enough structure to hold up a ceiling. So they would put a new structure every 20 years. But they learned how to put up those great temples in Kyoto from the Chinese. First of all, they would put the stakes, the wooden stakes, in some kind of cement or rock structure so they would not rot so easily. And they learned how to have long beams that connected at the top and the hooks on them so they could cover a much larger space. So they were able to build those great temples from what they learned from the Chinese from architecture. And then, of course, the classical Japanese instruments like koto was copied from the instruments they learned in China. And many of the songs and much of the literature began to develop based on what they had heard in China. So even though there were only a very small number of people, I don't know if there's any way of counting them, but perhaps over 238 years, perhaps a couple thousand Japanese, maybe even 3,000 or 4,000, who built this culture that became the center of Japanese culture and had a strong impact through the ages. Even today, some Japanese young children learn Tang poetry and they learn those histories, and it's because of what they learned from China. So the basics of the culture very deeply in Japan were learned from China. Of course, not only did the missions stay for sometimes a few months, but sometimes they left monks who were the intellectuals of the day, and the monks could study more deeply about all the different things in Chang'an. So until the next mission came, maybe 15, 20 years later, so the monks who were left over there could learn much more about Chang'an in detail, pass it on. And the Chinese were, at the time, very happy to pass on their culture to Japan. So there was no really hostility between the two countries. And so the basics of Japanese culture were formed from China. Then, of course, there were centuries when the contact was not nearly so close, or at least not so meaningful in terms of the impact on one country on the other. Of course, trade continued over the centuries. Some period, the Chinese complained of Woko, the Japanese pirates, and sometimes that word was used to mean Chinese pirates too, or Korean pirates. But in any case, there was not this deep learning from one country to another. In the next time period, when one country learned deeply from another country, I started in 1895. And until that time, China had looked down on Japan, those little squeaky islands over there, those little things. The little place over there. And then some people estimate if you asked 1,000 people in China, if China and Japan fought, they say, oh, China would destroy Japan so quickly. Maybe 999 Chinese would think that way. But in any case, they were so shocked in 1895 when suddenly Japan defeated China. And I think the Meiji Restoration, of course, provided a opportunity for the Japan to learn about the rest of the world. And in my own thinking, the Iwakura mission, where the Japanese sent a huge mission abroad for over 21 months to learn about things in the world, played a very key role in enabling Japan to move ahead in all kinds of industrialization, military organization. And when they fought in 1895, it's possible that China had as many ships as strong as Japan's. They bought some from Europe. But Japanese were better organized, they were better disciplined, and so they defeated the Chinese. Of course, at that time, the old system of preparing people for examinations was beginning to be questionable. In 1905, finally, they no longer had the old system for training officials, the examination system. And so the young people, instead of studying for the official examination, the young people in China wanted to study something. They didn't know what, it was no clear purpose at that time. But there were many people in China who realized the world had changed so much that they had to study in a much broader base from the whole world. And the government was at that time so disorganized that compared to the time when Japan had learned from China earlier, you had not central direction, but just a lot of individuals of middle-class families, the youth who wanted to go to Japan to study. And unfortunately, many people in both countries don't know that much about it, and it's not even much, hasn't been discussed widely in a lot of Western books, but there are some good scholars, and one, Paula Harrell, who wrote a couple books about the study in that period, agreed to cooperate with me in writing the chapter about that period because she's spent so many years studying it. But during that period after 1895, Chinese in so many different circles went to Japan to study. And of course, Sun Yat-sen was in Japan. Yeo-chi, Kang Yo-wei were in Japan. Jiang Bingling was there. And then later leaders like Chiang Kai-shek. And I'll come to him in a minute. Chiang Kai-shek, and when he had his imperial command in the 30s, some people say maybe half of the leaders, half of the generals had studied in Japan. So there was just enormous number who had studied in military. But not just the nationalists. Zhou Enlai had studied there. And then as Ambrose, getting ahead of me, said Lu Xun, Mao Dun, Gomoro, Yodafu. The whole modern literary movement of the 1920s, completely all from Japan. So you had literature, you had military, you had politics, and as you know, there was a Japanese writer named Kawakami Hajime who had translated a lot of the Marxist things into Japanese. He was a big Marxist. So where did the word Shohuijui, Gongchandang, where do those words come from? They came from Japanese, translated from Kawakami Hajime. So the whole political thinking and the political discourse, I remember one time, first time I heard the word Julobu for China, I couldn't figure out what the hell Julobu, where did that come from? Yeah, and of course, if you look at the characters in Japanese, it's kurabu, which is their transliteration for the word club. So, so many expressions into China, I think it really had a very deep impact. It was not the organized impact that the Japanese had when they were studying, but it was very wide in so many different fields and had really a tremendous impact. And because China was so disorganized at that time, it was not a systematic study, it was not systematically implemented. The way Japan is a much smaller, more integrated society had pushed Chinese learning, but still it had just a tremendous impact. Then the third period I talk about is the period beginning in 1978 when Deng Xiaoping came on. Because when Deng Xiaoping started the third plenum in December 1978, he already had been to the Southeast Asia and he had already visited Japan. He visited Japan in October 1978. And I'm sure he was already aware that he was going to have a more important position after December 1978. And he was thinking ahead as to the need for Japanese cooperation and building up after his reform and opening that began with the third plenum in December 1978. So while he was there, he visited a steel plant, Kimitsu, which is just across the harbor from Tokyo. And it was perhaps the most modern steel plant in the world. And it became the model for Baoshan. He visited a Nissan factory. Nissan was especially interesting to me because Yeo-chi, they had been in Manchuria before 1945, so it had a China connection that went back from before World War II. But Nissan was then a modern, beginning to produce modern cars, and so he visited and saw robots and he saw automatic. He asked the people at Nissan, he said, per worker, if you do a calculation per worker, how many cars a year would one worker produce? And they said maybe about 98, 99. He said, ours is about one. He said, you know, we Chinese, we shouldn't dress up like a fancy lady and try to look pretty when we are not pretty. We are behind and we have a lot of catching up to do. And at the time, the car manufacture in China was almost like a handicraft industry. I remember visiting some steel plants in the early 1980s, and where people were pounding, you know, it was making steel again was almost like a handicraft industry. So they were able to learn modern steel producing. They were able to learn car industry. He also went down to Osaka and saw Matsushita Konosuke, whom he called the god of enterprise. They made Panasonic. And of course, at that time, they did not yet have the internet, but they had electronics. And when he visited, there was almost no television in China. But he got the cooperation of Matsushita Konosuke to produce a lot of modern electronic goods. And Matsushita, who had been in China working in the 20s and 30s, was very eager to spread around throughout China. So it was a very foresighted journey and picking up certain key industries. He also, of course, rode on the Shinkansen, the Shinkansen line. Now, of course, people estimate about half of the world mileage in rapid trains is in China. At that time, it was 0. And so the first Chinese leader who rode on the fast train was Deng. So again, that was the model, became the model for what they could learn from Japan about building modern industry. One thing, the way I put it, is the Japanese have not learned to say I'm sorry enough to China, and China has not learned enough to say thank you to Japan. But at that time, I think for a lot of Japanese who knew what horrible things they did in World War II, they didn't like to apologize, but they felt that after all, they needed to contribute for some of the horror things they've done, and also to develop a new kind of economic relationship. They needed to make a little investment and to get better feelings from China so they could carry on economic relations. So in the 1980s, therefore, when the Chinese requested certain kind of equipment, Japanese JETRO would send in specialists in various kind of sectors. So it wasn't just the setting up of Japanese factories, it was also the sending in of technicians. One other thing that I think somehow has not received as much attention as it deserves is that Gu Mu, the Chinese vice premier, had a special group of advisors from Japan who came to him. And those advisors had played a role in the beginning mid-1950s, who were beginning to develop, really lead catch-up from the industrial country. And the United States did not ever have the kind of industrial power where the government played a major role in trying to modernize or catch up with other countries. But in Japan, because it was a late developer, it had in the not only in the Meiji period, but again in 1955, it's had a lot of leaders who were looking to the West and trying to play a role in a market economy and a capitalist economy and modernize the country. It was not socialist planning like in the Soviet Union, but it was working with companies in such a way that they would help provide the necessary capital, the joint study programs, the inviting of foreign experts and so forth. So the government took a positive role in pushing toward modernizing the whole country. And the leader of that group for Gumu was Ota Saburo, who had grown up in Manchuria in the 1930s and had a special feeling toward China. And so I think that Japanese advisory group at the high level about how the government plays a role in modernizing in a market economy really played a very important role. I don't know why that hasn't received more attention in the academic literature. The group operated privately and to advisors to the government, but somehow the people who were involved on both sides have not really given it the publicity I think it deserves. So, in short, Japan played a very big role in modernizing. Now, so those are the three big periods. Then to sort of jump up to the more current period, and to sort of maybe engage some of the conversation, I want to describe the period that Ambrose mentioned around 2010 when I was deciding to work on this, how bad the relationships were between the two countries and why. In the year 2010, two ships bumped into each other, a Chinese ship and a Japanese ship, and there was a huge commotion and tension between the two countries. And 2 years later, in what the Chinese call it Yeo-chi, and the Japanese call it Senkaku Islands, there was a privatization. The companies which were privately owned land was bought by the company, and that was called nationalization. There was just a huge Chinese reaction, and there was real fuss. My interpretation of that now, I'm thinking about why there was such a big fuss at that time, and that's what made me decide to work on this book, because just at that time there was such huge tension. But underneath what was going on at that time, I think, it was that China was catching up and surpassing Japan. From 1895 until about 2008, the Japanese were the strong military power, and even though the Japanese were business people were not so nasty in the 1980s when they came, still they were proud. They wore suits and had modern communication, and the Chinese were lower down on the totem pole. So Japan really had the upper hand until about 2008. In 2008, there were two big events, I think, that really changed China's attitude. They knew they were going to surpass Japan quantitatively, economically, pretty soon. But in addition, the Western financial crisis occurred that year, and the Japanese economy was in trouble, and the Chinese gained more confidence that maybe their way was not so bad. They were not so badly affected by the 2008 financial crisis. But also, the best Olympics that had ever been held were held in 2008 in Beijing. And the grandeur of the scale, and I think the symbolic meaning of all the countries sending representatives to Beijing provided a lot of grandeur. And the Chinese could see that soon their economy would pass out of Japan's. And in 2010, the World Bank said the Chinese economy is now bigger than the Japanese GNP. And so, to me, what was underlying the tensions and the Chinese confidence in dealing with Japan in the very tough way they developed with and demands they were making in Japan was the fact that the positions had been reversed. That in history, up until 1895, the power in Asia, that power was, of course, China. And Japan was the smaller power. In the period from about 2008 to 2012, that period, China was surpassing that of Japan. And since that time, I think it's clear that China is not only stronger economically, it has more global political influence, it has now a much bigger military. And so there was a transition where China was behaving quite with great confidence. I remember, to me, when the Japanese in the 1980s were doing so well economically, a lot of Japanese came to the United States, and a lot of people thought they were acting arrogantly. It reminded me of kind of a nouveau riche politically. Like a nouveau riche, because they were Baofahu. Japan was a Baofahu, and they were quite proud. And I think some of that same pride among the Chinese who suddenly felt, we've been bowing down to the Japanese, in fact, since 1895, and now we don't have to anymore. Now it's time for Japanese to bow down to China. So to me, that was some underlying emotion that colored Chinese attitudes during that period when China was gaining the upper hand. And it seems to be one way of thinking about what's happened since that time is the two nations are trying to now find a stable way of handling the fact that now China is in the superior position and China and Japan is now in the lower position. In some ways, Japan technology and social life is still doing extremely well. I think China still has a lot to learn from Japan in terms of how to have a clean, polite society with good control over the environment. But there's no question that China has now gained the upper hand in the relationship. The other new development, it seems to me, that's affecting the China-Japan relationship is the United States. The United States had so dominated the world after World War II that I think that the United States was quite proud. But now that the United States is playing a smaller role, Japan and China are beginning to fill up some of that space. And I think for the Chinese who in the 1990s found it useful to build patriotism by complaining about Japan and by encouraging a lot of movies about World War II, now they don't have to use World War II movies to create patriotism. That big country, North America, is behaving so badly. And with the Trump administration, the mood in Washington, you don't need Japan as the enemy anymore if you're trying to unite China. There's another place that's quite useful. So I think those changes are also now behind a new period. And Ambrose was quite right in getting at my key point. I don't expect China and Japan to suddenly become great lovers and great friends. There's too much history and there's too complicated. But I think that the pragmatists who realize that they can work together and find more ways to work together have a good opportunity when cherry blossoms bloom in Japan this year and Xi Jinping comes to visit to make a very considerable step forward in improving the relationship. Thank you very much.
Questions?
Of course.
Okay, now invite questions.
You want to call on the people, the questioners? Ambrose, you want
Question? Yeah, any question?
I see some hands already. You want to call on them?
This young gentleman happened to be my grandson.
Oh, Adrian.
Really?
Okay.
Thank you for your
Can you press the microphone button?
Turn on the microphone.
Good afternoon.
He read your books.
What role do you think Hong Kong has in the relationship of China and Japan?
Would you speak louder?
I know, I got the point.
You got
Did everybody else get the point? What's Hong Kong's role between China and Japan? From the point of view of China and Japan, the big issues that they face with each other, Hong Kong is not one of the major issues. Of course, they both have feelings about Hong Kong, and they both look to Hong Kong in different ways. But I don't think that, from the point of view of Beijing now, Hong Kong is not a major power. I think the relationship between Hong Kong and China has changed greatly since 1978. In 1978, when they were starting reform and opening, Hong Kong had so much to offer. It was the gateway to Western learning and technology and funding. Now, Beijing has much of that. Even Shenzhen on the other side of the border has much of the same. Shanghai, Beijing. So from the point of view of Beijing, Hong Kong is no longer nearly as important. I think that's just realistic. I think from the point of view of Japan, Hong Kong is still a convenient place to work in China. A lot of Japanese like living here. They feel the freedom which they have and the greater freedom they have than in China. But I don't think it's a big issue between the two countries. I don't expect that Japanese support for freedom in Hong Kong is going to be a major part of the difficulties that China and Japan are facing. So I think as an outsider, I try to tell it like it is, and that's my view of the situation.
If you don't mind, I exercise my privilege. I will follow my grandson to ask another question. How about Taiwan? Taiwan is different, honestly.
Well, Taiwan is a longer issue, and I'll give my explanation. And I think the comparison between Taiwan and South Korea is very interesting.
Yeah.
Because after the 1895, when Japan acquired Taiwan, after all, was a prefecture, was not even a province.
Right.
I'm sorry, a few years before it had become a province, but it was only a prefecture until the 1880s. Right. And so when Japan took it over, it was a very small, it was not an important part of China, and the Chinese leadership had not done a lot in Taiwan. So when Japan first took it over, the first 2 or 3 years, they were really very tough. And the General Nogi, who had fought at the Sino-Japanese War, came into Taiwan and was very tough. And a lot of people were killed. But by about 3 years later, they appointed another guy named Goto Shinpei to be in charge of the administration in Taiwan. He was quite a remarkable man. This was a guy who had studied medicine in Germany and was a brilliant public health servant, and then had become a public health administrator. And he was much more enlightened. Later, he was the guy who directed Manchurian Research Institute in Mantetsu Chosabu, the Research Institute in Manchuria. But he became the civil administrator, and he tried to introduce a much broader and more enlightened administrative structure for, and so he raised the education level, he raised the public health, of course, and by the time 1945, the education level of Taiwan was much higher than mainland. The standard of living was much higher. They had railways, they had more transport, and of course, bright Taiwanese in their schools learned Japanese. So it was such a deep occupation that in a way people almost became Japanese. And so after World War II, when the Kuomintang came and clamped down first, and especially in our February 26th incident. And they killed so many local people. Some Taiwanese local people felt the Kuomintang is even worse than the Japanese. So Japan, therefore, had a link to the local population compared to the outsiders. And for people in the mainland who were trying to gain control over Taiwan, Japan was a very questionable place. And when Japan began to really modernize and the wages went up and they wanted their textiles to go someplace else, Taiwan and South Korea were some of the first places that they went. But if you compare Taiwan and South Korea, after all, was a nation. Korea was a nation. So there's a much more organized resistance. In Taiwan, you didn't have that national structure, and traditionally, since it had only been a prefecture, it didn't have the integration and the resistance to Japanese colonialism. And in 1919, Korea had a tremendous independence movement. Taiwan had nothing of that. So from the point of view of the communists now who want to move into Taiwan, the Japanese are a nuisance because they have too close a deeper relationship with the locals. And somebody like Li Denghui, when I'll tell you a little personal story. I was in a group to go in to see Li Denghui, and one of the Chinese guys there knew that I spoke Japanese, and he said, "When you meet Li Denghui, Vogel, why don't you start out talking to him in Japanese? He'll feel very good about that because his Japanese is better than his Chinese." So I did, and it worked. So it shows that Li Denghui how close he felt to Japan. Oh, yeah. And so if you were somebody in Beijing looking at that, you would not be very happy with that. So, and maybe that's a long-winded answer, but I think China, the Taiwan situation, and Japan's role with China is much more complicated. And now they see the Japanese links to local Taiwanese. When local Taiwanese say they're not Chinese, a lot of people in Taiwan still look to Japan for culture. So I think that from the eyes of Beijing, Japan is an obstacle in Taiwan. That's my reading of the situation. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Margaret Liu from the American Chamber of Commerce.
I'll see you in a couple of days.
Yes, see you on Wednesday. And thank you very much, Professor Vogel, for giving us your perspective on Sino-Japan relations and its long history. And it's interesting, during your remarks, you mentioned about how the Chinese have not been saying enough thank you to the Japanese.
Yes.
But I think if you look at the context in U.S.-China relations, I think it's very important as well for the Chinese to be thankful to Americans because the U.S. were the one who allowed China to integrate into the global economy by granting China the MFN, Most Favored Nation status, as well as allowing China to join the WTO. And since it's at the beginning of the diplomatic relations, the U.S. allowed China to send in hundreds of thousands of students to study in the United States to bring back those liberal values, which are very vital to China's modernization 40 years ago. So as the two countries are in a critical juncture in terms of relations, what advice would you give to both Beijing and Washington?
Well, I don't give advice to Beijing, and I don't think they listen to me. I try to get, what I would think if I were Chinese advising the Chinese government, I would say, America is going through some growing pains, and they're causing lots of problems, but they did, after all, contribute, and it would be better to try to find ways to work with the United States. And things like economic standards now, this idea that they would split and that growing localism, I think is not good for China, not good for the world. And I would hope Chinese would advise Beijing in that way. What I say to Washington is there's a lot more we can do positively toward China. I'm now working with some of my colleagues at Harvard to try to write a report that would come out in October to advise the new president. We don't think there's much chance that a report coming out now would be implemented by President Trump. We're not very optimistic that he would listen to us and that he would have the integrated government policy. But our hope is that they might listen to us. And I think the essence of what we would argue is that we have to manage rivalry. We want to help the United States do well. We don't want China to take advantage of our business span in an unequal way. We don't want them to push us out of East Asia, our military. We want to keep freedom of navigation. But even when China passes us, we have to find ways to work with. The world is now too small. So the environment, international economic structure, we have to find some way to work with these people. So, we're still trying to think through the details of how we would advise the next president to do. But that's the essence of what I would propose.
So are you suggesting Trump will not be re-elected, as you just suggested the next president?
I always tell my audiences I am a scholar, not a fortune teller, and I don't know. As you know, there are very divided estimates, and if anything, I think there's a good chance that he will not be elected. But even if he is elected, my hope is that his administration would think a little bit about history and his historical impact. And some of the ideas that we suggest might be adopted even by Trump. So the ideas that we will write about are not just anti-Trump. They are what we think America should do, and that we would hope that some of Trump's followers and supporters would also think that some of the things that we advise would be useful. Yeah.
Okay, maybe let's look to this side. Yes, please.
My name is Raymond Wan. I study I worked in Japan for about more than 10 years. I studied at Soviet University at that time.
Which university?
Soviet.
Sophia. Okay.
Soviet University, yeah.
Okay.
So, well, my question is, now given the change of the Trump administration or the American administration towards East Asia, especially towards China, and we look for allies, or reaffirm the allies' position with Japan towards China, like a few days ago, the meeting of the reaffirmation of the peace treaty, the security treaty with Japan, United States. So how do you look at the position of Japan towards this new relationship? And how should Japan be changed in light of the new demands from the U.S., not just the Trump administration, but the whole nation?
If I were a Japanese advising the Japanese government, I would say there is considerable opportunity now for economic investment in China and chance for improving relationship. But I would say you cannot rely on Chinese military attitudes. If China should become very strong militarily, and Japan could not, there's no way that Japan, with a smaller population base and a smaller economy, will have a military to match China, that it would be very important to keep the security relationship with the United States. Trump now is behaving in such a way that I think around the world, many countries begin to doubt whether the United States would be fully behind them. We have a more selfish, self-centered policy. We're trying to encourage all countries to buy more of our goods and to contribute more to military defense against the risks around the world. And we're expecting the same thing of China. So if I were Japanese, I would be a little more worried about the United States. And I think quietly Japanese are talking that way, but I wouldn't say that publicly. Publicly, I would say we are a very firm ally of the United States. We will always remain a very firm ally, and it's in our interest. That's what I would say publicly. I think that there are Japanese now who realize that since World War II, they have been what the Japanese call deshi. They have not been the big, decision independent power. They have been following America. And even I remember talking to many Japanese about foreign policy, and the first thing they say is, what's America going to do, and then what should we do? I think now there is room for a little more independence. And I think Japanese vis-a-vis Russia and India and China are behaving a little more independently. But frankly, I don't think they are fully prepared for it. When Japanese give a speech, it's often very friendly feeling. But because they're so homogeneous, the Japanese have what they call ishin denshin. Where they sort of, you don't have to explain everything because people, they know each other and they sort of sense what the other guy says. And so at public speaking to foreigners, there aren't many Japanese who grew up naturally seeing how you explain in a big, broad, national, rational way how to explain things to foreigners. And I think Japan, therefore, is not yet quite ready for the big stage. They haven't done the preparation in public speaking or independent policy or independent thinking to play really a major role. But I think they would like to move in that direction. I don't expect there to be big steps, but I think that they will move in that direction. My friend Michelson has a, yeah.
I don't want to interrupt. I just wanted to play off of that, Professor Vogel, that I agree with what you just said about the Japanese, but turn on the Chinese, since they became part of more active internationally, they've also become more visible, including in the established Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank, the IMF in particular, and the WTO, and now with the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank and so on. And with America moving back a little bit in terms of those roles, what do you see as China going forward? Are they the new globalists, and are they going to perform an important role in this? You're right, the Japanese never really took that role.
Well, as you know, Xi Jinping, was it 2 or 3 years ago at Davos, made a speech. Well, that was the essence of what he was saying. We are the new globalists. I personally think the United States was very wrong not to join AIIB, the Asia Investment Bank, and to discourage other countries from joining. I think it was a bad mistake. I think China taking a greater role is good. I think the United States was not flexible enough in the World Bank and others of giving China more authority and more power as they've gained influence and economic weight. I think we've been behind. I think the Belt and Road Initiative, we should have been much more encouraging. And I think we made real mistakes, and particularly the AIIB, the bank. I mean, the head of that had worked at ADB with the Japanese in the Philippines, and he knew people in the World Bank. And the person he chose to write the legal documents for the AIIB was a woman named Natalie Lichtenstein, who was my undergraduate student, and who graduated Harvard Law School. And he had known her through World Bank. And so here was a real effort of the Chinese to reach out and to develop an international legal institution and to do it in a way that other countries cooperate. And the United States made a very bad mistake. I think the reaction to Chinese power is somehow too scary, and the idea of communism is too threatening to too many American minds. That we don't have an appropriate policy for responding to Chinese initiatives. And I hope the new administration, we're not going to join AIIB quickly or the Belt and Road, but I hope that we can step back from our very bad response to those two and take a more positive response to those two. That's my sense. Yeah. Do you want to?
Yes.
Yeah. There's a lady up there.
I was impressed with the CEO Press
when they were publishing your book?
So I fortunately read the original Chinese version of your book. As I read, I can see many hidden sides and facts that not that popular with the public. So we can form more objective view of the relationship between two countries. And it is common, and we can also read in this book, that we treat China and Japan as two entities, or even as two humans. But actually, they both consist of people with very different conceptions, memories, and backgrounds. So I think the book itself have limited the public group it can reach. So my question is, how did you deal with and approach the public material, historical materials, and how should we do to improve the communication between the populace from two countries?
I think it's true that some Japanese reading my book will say I'm too pro-Chinese, and some Chinese looking at my book will say I'm too pro-Japanese.
Then you're fair.
When I was doing the research, I have a Chinese friend who was from the CUHK and日本研究所, and he was at the Japan Center in Beijing, and he was giving me some very good advice about Chinese attitudes. And several places I changed already when I wrote it because of him. But now, Ganchi, I hope you don't think I'm giving away too many secrets, but I published it in Hong Kong with the Chinese U because I believe they are very fair, published it exactly as I believed it, and Yeo-chi, who's a very fine historian, even found some mistakes and corrected already. And now I'm preparing to submit in Beijing to a publisher called Zhongxin. And we already have a contract between Chinese press and Zhongxin. And some of my friends at Zhongxin I met with in Beijing recently, and they have some suggestions of things I could do differently to explain more better to a Chinese audience. And I feel very fortunate because I think they are very fair. And many of the suggestions that they are making, for example, one suggestion they made was, I said there was a patriotic, after June 4th, there was a patriotic education campaign, and therefore the propaganda department made many movies of World War II. They said, in fact, many of the movies were made by private companies on the view of the private, and they sensed the mood and the policy, but it was not the government that forced them to do that. But many of them took that as a private. I believe they are correct. I believe that that example is a good example of things that I am happily changing for the Chinese mainland edition. So fortunately, the people at Zhongxin have been very careful in going through the manuscript and trying to think through places where the Chinese publishers would be upset and where I should try to present things fairly. If I don't agree with something, I won't accept it. I mean, I'm not going, when I was doing the description, the changes for the mainland for Deng Xiaoping, my view was that there were certain ideas, if they wanted to publish something that I disagreed with strongly, I would not let them publish it. And I feel the same way this way. If they would demand things that I cannot agree with, I would say, don't publish under my name. But fortunately, I have many good friends in China who are very knowledgeable and who understand my meaning and are trying to find ways to say things in China that are not incorrect. Some of my American friends will say, you gave in too easily because you should, if they don't publish every word just as you say it, you shouldn't publish. They can criticize me that way. I think it's better different countries have different views, and it looks to me as if I'm now very optimistic that I will be able to publish with Zhongxian in China, and that I will be able to make changes that are accurate, that I can accept, and that are a somewhat different way of putting things. And so it's like trying to thread the eye of a needle. But I'm optimistic with Ganqi's help that we'll be able to achieve, and Minlei and others, that I'll be able to achieve that.
Yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Yan-Chi Ming. Right, it's the question on Japanese mentality. What is the underlying mentality that the Japanese never say sorry enough? And a probably related question. Now, the United States is the first country that actually beats Japan and occupies Japan. So why aren't the Japanese, feeling bad about the Americans? And instead, they treat Americans as the overlord.
First, the underlying Japanese mentality. For one thing, the current generation feels that they were not even alive at the time of World War II. So many young Japanese say, I'm 40 years old, I was not alive in World War II. Why should I apologize for what was done before I was born? They say, do the Belgians still apologize for Belgian Congo? Does the United States still apologize to the American Indians? A certain period of time has passed. Why should the new generation? That's one attitude. Another part of it is that a lot of Japanese want to think their grandfathers did not do bad things. And when I first began research in Japan, I was studying the family. And a lot of the family members knew their grandfathers fought in China. And maybe they had a feeling that they did wrong things, but they didn't want to have such bad feelings about their grandparents. They want to think the grandfather was not really such a bad guy. And the grandfather didn't want to talk about the horrible things that he did. So I think that's another part of it. And another thing is that they don't like the way the Chinese are pushing him to bow down. They feel that they have apologized after all. The Chinese say you never apologize. Well, Murayama wrote quite a long apology, and some of the other prime ministers. In my view, it's too brief. My advice to Japanese always is they should have a fuller apology, and they should teach it in their high schools so that all the Japanese would know about that. But for reasons of national pride, they don't want to. So that's my best understanding of the Japanese mentality. It has those elements. On the question of the United States and Japan, I think it's interesting, why China still becomes so upset about World War II. You take the Vietnamese now, for example. I think America did horrible things in Vietnam, the bombing and the destruction, the use of chemicals and destroying crops. And yet the Vietnamese do not behave toward the United States the way the Chinese feel toward Japan. And I think, of course, the United States in fighting Japan, they did not occupy America in the same way. They bombed us and we lost many lives. But the Chinese suffered much more in World War II than the Americans did. So I can understand that quite difference. But still, it was very interesting in the occupation, 1945, when it first began, the Americans were quite upset at we really wanted to punish Japan for what they did. But when the Cold War came, we could see they could be our ally. So by 1947-48, the United States became much more open in working with Japan and much more helpful in their economic recovery. So I think that's part of the reason. But I think it's also somehow the Chinese have particularly stuck on World War II with Japan's anti-Japanese sentiment more than many countries feel toward their former enemies.
May I ask a question?
Of course, you're the guy. You're the chairman. I'm just.
How is your book received in Japan? I mean, this book.
I gave it's translated in Japanese and published by Nikkei, and I gave a few lectures on it in different places. Politely, I would say, I don't feel it's somehow the reaction is a deep emotional response. They say, okay, it was a scholarly book, and they recommend and think it's a good book. But it has not had a big emotional impact. It sells quite a few copies, and I think we'll probably sell more. And I hope that when Xi Jinping goes to Japan, the more Japanese will buy the book. But I cannot be I think the reviews in Japan have been quite favorable, but not emotional. Okay.
Talking about the book, I must say the publication of this book is really an event in our the editor's history. Yeah. Now you mentioned several times about the Chinese version.
Yes.
Because today I keep saying that China, Japan facing history. The Chinese version is 中国和日本1500年的交流史，这个是很恰当的 ，very 恰当。那么整个的过程，
应该感谢那个中文出版社。
In the whole process, I must say that your whole editorial board should be congratulated. Sure. They're doing an excellent job. Sure. Particularly, I must say, you mentioned about Yeo-chi女士. Is she here?
You're the editor of this book.
Yeah, editor of this.
他是修了那个博士学位，在美国修了博士学位，也非常认真的，非常。
Princeton doctor, it's wonderful.
Yeah,
but
上一本书的 editor 是林颖 ，University of Washington.
You mean Deng Xiaoping and
对呀
that's Lin. So I must say, the Professor Fanny Zhang, since you are the Senate Committee Chairman of the publication since. I must say that they're doing very well.
I'm very proud of our team.
Yeah, they're doing very well. It's wonderful. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor King.
Yeah. Question continues.
Thank you so much for staying so long. Thank you very much.
Oh, I get the order. Now you can raise questions in Cantonese.
No, Cantonese 不行啊，我们識講啊，唔識講啊。
Yeah, okay. Chinese and English. Yeah, 方景.
We always talk in English anyhow.
No. His English is not as good as Chinese. Oh. So he should.
Superb English.
Well, Ezra, it's great to see you here again. I still remember almost 40 years ago when we first met and discussed. I learned a lot from you about Japan in those days. You gave me the reading list and you gave me the right dictionary. When we talk about Japan, I think we Chinese always think of England. Japan takes England as a model, and the Sino-Japanese relationship always reminds me one of the relationship between UK and Europe. That is a big topic now, of course. It just occurred to me, it took about 100 years. Well, England and France has a lot of long history interactions. But they really came to terms of each other after 100 years. In mid-18th century, England got all the French colonies, and they never got together again until mid-19th century. So 100 years. Similarly, UK and Germany took about 100 years to entangle and came to some understanding of each other, starting with mid-19th until the mid-20th century. Again, between China and Japan, if we take 2008, as you put it, as some kind of mode of understanding between the two, and starting from 1895, that's 100 years, a little bit more.
Yes.
It just occurred to me, China and America really got to understand each other, starting with the Korean War. Before then, of course, we had a lot of people coming to the US and learn and so on, but there's no real entanglement until the Korean War. Now, do you think, after 100 years, and that is 2050, China and America will come to some kind of understanding, begin to understand each other's strength and weakness, and to learn of the bad things and good things of each other, and begin to be able to live with each other quite comfortably? Do you think that's a fair expectation 30 years from now?
2058.
2050.
2050.
Starting with 1950.
That's a good question.
As I think, about the Chinese Sanguo Yuanyi, in that story, from my memory, very often two warriors, bump and they fight, and then they turn out to be about equal, and then they become friends. And so, of course, that's my hope with the United States and China.
That should be our belief.
That's our, but I'm afraid it's just a hope. And I think it's certainly the mood in Washington against communism, the prejudice, in my view, is a prejudice against communism. And the failure to understand China is very deep. And the reluctance to admit that China is surpassing us in some ways around the world is very hard for Americans to take. So I don't, you suggested half a century? I don't think it could take place much faster. I worry now about the effort to decouple because, if you have certain standards for 5G and Chinese dominate much of the world and the United States will not accept, we have a whole different standards for the West. It seems to be foolish. We would do much, and I think businessmen are so clever, they will find ways to get around this. So Chinese businesses have trouble to export to the United States, so they export to Vietnam, and Vietnam exports to the United States, or they export to Korea, and Korea exports to, so it's not called Chinese quota. Businessmen are so clever, they can find so many ways. And I think the supply chain will not be so disrupted. I don't think it's possible. Businesses can work faster than governments. So around the world, I think there'll still be supply chain that I don't think we can have complete decoupling. Things happen too quickly. Businessmen are faster than governments. So my hope now is during the Trump era that we can find people in both countries who can work with each other despite our governments. And my impression of Washington is there are quite a few civil servants who try to do their job properly, no matter what Trump says. Their life is more complicated because they cannot write things down because tomorrow Trump may put he may Twitter and say something just opposite. So they have to be careful they talk. And then when Trump says some crazy thing, they have to repeat the crazy thing. But still they try to do the job anyhow. And I think in China, you have many fine bureaucrats who understand the world and understand the complexities, who are trying to adapt to the world. And even if the Chinese top leaders are very tough on the United States, I think there are many people in China that many of us in the United States can still work with. And I think in the scholarly field, of course, and business field, I think that will continue. I think the top leaders cannot stop that. So I wish I were around to see 30 years from now. You and my generation, I'm afraid, we will not see the day.
We won't see it.
We will not see the day, but we hope some of you young people who are here today will see that day.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. One question more.
I have a question.
No. Yeah.
Professor, we all know that I'm a high school teacher. So we all know that there are many factors affecting the relations between China and Japan. And we all agree that two of the most significant factors or driving force were the U.S. factor and the history legacy. So according to your opinion, which one is more important in the coming up 21st century, and that will shape the relations between China and Japan?
I'm not sure I got that question.
Which one is more important or more significant in the coming up days for the relations between China and Japan? I mean, the U.S. factor and the history legacy between China and Japan.
Oh, I see.
U.S. factor.
I think the most important thing probably are the estimates of leaders of each country of the utilitarian nature of the relationship. I think a lot of Japanese companies and leaders are not happy with what they do in China, what they see in China, but they see an opportunity. And I think that they will try to find that opportunity as it is. And my estimate of Chinese leaders are quite pragmatic in dealing with Japan. So although I think that history and the U.S. factor are important in understanding, I think that the key predictors of how they will behave is the estimate the leaders have of what pragmatic, their estimate of what their national interest is at that time.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, actually it should be the end. However, I consider my grandson also raised hands. So I didn't give him a chance. And I struggle with myself. Should I give the chance to him or not? So I'm going to ask Ezra, do you want to give me one chance more?
I think you'd be nice to your grandson.
Okay, all right.
Good afternoon, Professor Vogel. Thank you very much for your talk. I've gained a lot of new insights on Sino-Japan relations. So my question is, regarding China and Japan's current relations, what suggestions do you have for both governments in order to keep peace and also mutual benefit?
I think now they're already doing a lot of things which are constructive. They're trying to find areas, for example, in the medical field where they can cooperate. They're trying to find areas in technology and environment where they can work together. I think that's very helpful. I think China at this point is reluctant to send the top officials to Japan. What I would hope for is that the top leaders would develop a kind of trust relationship. You know, there's no Chinese today like Liao Chengzhi.
Yeah.
There was a guy named Liao Chengzhi who was a Chinese patriot and was on the Politburo at one time. His father, Liao Zhongkai, went to Japan, and so he attended elementary school some in Japan, and then later attended Waseda University for a while, and then he was a real revolutionary leader, and he was so high that when Japanese visited Beijing, they could see him in a hoo, you know. He could speak Japanese at least as well as
just
they
like
could, better than I can. He was superb. And so there's nobody who has that kind of feeling about Japan now. The ambassadors have had very good language training who go to Japan.
But that's not enough.
That's not enough. They don't have the heart, and they don't have the friendship.
Right.
And so I think to build trust, you need deeper friendship. And I think that so far the Chinese top leaders are reluctant to have that kind of deep relation. I think a lot of Japanese would like to have that. I think that the Japanese are more willing to form that kind of closer relationship. But somehow the structure of Chinese leadership, they send people well trained in language who study history or literature to Japan to represent them, but they don't have, they're not on the Politburo, and that I think that high-level trust would be really a very valuable contribution to the relationship, and I think that really depends on Beijing. I think Japan would be quite willing to do that. Yeah.
Probably only after supposed
Yeah.
Okay. I must say we have a wonderful talk, Professor Vogel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.